Stand in the heat. Have you ever watched someone choose to stay when the whole world told them to walk away? When the sun burns so hot it strips everything down to what's real. No mercy, no shade, just truth. This is the story of a man who didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to be there. If you want to see how far love can reach when it's built on nothing but showing up, stay with me until the end. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat that summer didn't just arrive. It settled in like something alive, something patient and mean. It pressed down on the Wyoming frontier with a weight that made breathing feel like work and thinking feel like drowning. The sky stretched white and merciless from horizon to horizon, and the dust that rose from the parched earth hung in the air long after the wagons passed, turning every breath into grit. Elias Mercer sat beneath the warped wooden awning outside Calloway's saloon, shoulders hunched over a tin plate of beans and cornbread. The awning had been built for cooler days, back when shade still meant something. Now it just framed the misery differently. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt in a wide V, and his hat brim cast a slim shadow across eyes that had learned not to expect much from the world. He ate slowly, methodically, the way a man eats when food is fuel and nothing more. Across from him, maybe 10 feet away, stood a little girl. She was barefoot, sunburned across her nose and cheeks in angry red patches that would peel in a day or two. Her dress, once blue, now faded to something between gray and dust, hung loose on a frame that had gone too long without enough. Her hair, tangled and knotted, fell past bony shoulders, but it was her eyes that stopped people. Hollow. Still, like she'd seen something that carved out everything soft and left only the shape of a child behind. Her name was Mara. She was 7 years old, and her parents had died the night before. No one in town talked about it directly. That wasn't the way things worked out here. You acknowledged tragedy the way you acknowledged a bad harvest, quietly, with a nod, and then you moved on because dwelling didn't plow fields or mend fences. The Hutchinsons had been passing through, heading west with promises of land and a fresh start. Their wagon had broken an axle just beyond the ridge, and by the time someone found them the next morning, the heat had already taken them both. Heat stroke, the doc said. Dehydration, bad luck. Mara had been found sitting between them, silent, her small hands resting on her mother's arm. Now she stood outside the saloon, watching Elias eat. She didn't beg, didn't speak, didn't move. She just stood there, and the whole town pretended not to see her. Elias chewed another bite of cornbread, jaw working slow. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her, but his hand paused over the plate, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted, just barely, like a man bracing against a wind only he could feel. He set his fork down, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he slid the plate forward across the weathered table, the scrape of tin against wood loud in the thick silence. "Go on," he said quietly. Mara didn't hesitate. She moved fast, too fast, like someone who'd learned that opportunity was a narrow window that closed without warning. She grabbed the plate with both hands and ate standing up, shoveling beans into her mouth with her fingers, cornbread crumbling as she bit into it with a desperation that made grown men look away. Elias leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the street instead of her. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Behind him, the saloon door creaked open, and Sheriff Tom Garvin stepped out, thumbs hooked in his belt, eyes squinting against the glare. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, and graying at the temples, with the kind of face that had seen too much to be shocked by anything anymore. He looked at Mara, then at Elias. "Hell of a thing," Garvin said. Elias didn't respond. "Can't just leave her standing in the street." "Ain't leaving her anywhere." Garvin sighed, scratching at his beard. "Elias, you know how this works. Girl's got no kin here, no one to take her. We'll have to send word east, find a home, a church group, something." "She's eating," Elias said flatly. "I can see that." "Then let her finish." Garvin studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You got a soft spot showing, Mercer. Dangerous thing in this heat." Elias finally looked up at him, eyes hard. "You telling me to let her starve?" "I'm telling you not to get attached to something you can't fix." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mara finished the beans, dragging her fingers across the plate to catch every last bit. She set it down carefully, then wiped her mouth with the hem of her dress. Her eyes flicked to Elias just once before dropping back to the ground. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was small, cracked, like it hadn't been used in days. Elias stood, chair scraping back. He picked up the empty plate and handed it to Garvin without a word, then walked past both of them toward the livery stable where his horse was tied. Mara watched him go, and then, without being told, she followed. The barn on Elias Mercer's property was older than the house. It leaned slightly to the east, weathered gray by years of sun and wind, but it was sturdy enough. The roof didn't leak, the doors still closed, and up in the loft, above the empty stalls where his two horses shuffled and stomped, there was a space where the air moved just enough to make sleeping possible. That's where he put her. He didn't ask if she wanted to stay, didn't make a speech about charity or kindness. He just climbed the ladder, cleared a space in the hay, and laid out an old horse blanket. "You sleep here," he said. "Don't go wandering at night. Coyotes come close sometimes." Mara nodded, eyes wide. "There's a barrel by the door. Water. You drink when you need to. Don't wait till you're dizzy." Another nod. Elias hesitated at the top of the ladder, one hand on the rail, looking at her in the dim golden light filtering through the gaps in the wood. She looked impossibly small up there, swallowed by shadow and dust motes. "You scared?" he asked. She thought about it, then shook her head. He didn't believe her, but he didn't call her a liar either. "All right then." He climbed back down, boots thudding on the rungs, and crossed the yard to the house. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the evening settled in. Cicadas starting their nightly chorus, the last light bleeding out of the sky. Up in the loft, Mara sat on the blanket, knees pulled to her chest, and stared at the darkening world beyond the barn door. She didn't cry. She'd already done all the crying she had in her. The next morning, Elias found a pair of old sandals on the porch. They were too big for Mara, but they were better than nothing. He'd pulled them from a trunk in the back room, belongings left behind by someone who used to live here, someone he didn't talk about. He set them beside the barn door before dawn, then went about his work. When Mara woke and climbed down the ladder, she saw them immediately. She stood there for a long time, bare feet in the dirt, staring at the sandals like they might disappear if she blinked. Then she put them on. They flopped when she walked, leather straps loose around her ankles, but she didn't take them off. She wore them all day, even when the heat made her feet swell and the straps rubbed blisters she didn't mention. Elias noticed. He always noticed. That evening, he brought her a strip of cloth and showed her how to wrap it around the straps to cushion them. "Leather'll soften," he said. "Takes time." She nodded, watching his hands as he worked. "You got a name you like being called?" he asked. "Mara." "Mara," he repeated, testing it. "All right. I'm Elias." "I know." He glanced at her, surprised. "I heard the sheriff say it," she explained. Elias grunted, finishing the wrap. "Sheriff talks too much." Mara almost smiled. Almost. He handed the sandals back to her and she slipped them on again, wiggling her toes. The fit was better now. Not perfect, but better. "Thank you," she said again. Elias stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Don't thank me for what's decent." And then he walked back to the house, leaving her standing there in sandals that didn't quite fit and a world that didn't quite make sense anymore. The town didn't know what to make of it. At first they assumed Elias was just being practical, keeping the girl out of sight until the sheriff could arrange something permanent. But days passed, and Mara stayed. She slept in the barn. She drank from the barrel. She wandered the edges of the property, staying close to the fence line, never straying far. And Elias let her. He didn't parade her around, didn't introduce her to anyone, but he didn't hide her either. When he rode into town for supplies, she sat on the porch and waited. When he worked the fence, she watched from the shade of the oak tree. When he cooked supper, he made enough for two. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was something quieter than that. Something that didn't have a name. At the general store, Mrs. Calloway leaned across the counter, flour dust on her apron, and spoke in a low voice meant to sound concerned but edged with something sharper. "Elias, you know people are talking." He was counting coins, laying them out one by one. "People always talk. About you keeping that girl." I ain't keeping her. She's just there. For how long? He looked up at her then, eyes flat. Long as she needs. Mrs. Calloway pursed her lips. Sheriff says there's homes back east, good Christian homes, places that take in orphans. She ain't an orphan while I'm still breathing. The words came out harder than he intended, and the store went quiet. Two men by the door exchanged glances. Mrs. Calloway's face flushed. Well, she said stiffly, I suppose that's your business. It is. He scooped up his change, tipped his hat, and walked out. Behind him, the whispers started before the door even closed. Mara didn't speak much, but she listened to everything. She heard the way people's voices changed when they talked about her. The way they softened their words around Elias but sharpened them when he wasn't listening. She heard the pity, the suspicion, the judgment. She understood more than they thought she did. One afternoon, she was sitting on the porch steps, peeling an apple Elias had left for her, when a woman approached the fence. She was younger than Mrs. Calloway, with a kind face and a basket on her arm. Hello there, the woman said gently. Mara looked up but didn't respond. My name's Sarah. I live just down the road. She smiled. I thought you might like some cookies. I made extra. She held out the basket. Mara set the apple down and stood, moving slowly to the fence. She took one cookie, then stepped back. Thank you, she said quietly. Sarah's smile widened. You're very welcome, sweetheart. She paused, glancing toward the house. Is Mr. Mercer treating you all right? Mara nodded. You're not scared of him? Mara frowned. Why would I be scared? Sarah blinked, caught off guard. Oh, no reason. Some men, they're not good with children. Elias is good, Mara said firmly. Sarah studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'm glad to hear that. She hesitated. If you ever need anything, you come find me, all right? My house is the one with the blue shutters. Mara nodded again, and Sarah left, basket swinging. When Elias came back from the south pasture that evening, Mara was still holding the cookie, uneaten. You gonna eat that or just look at it? He asked. She glanced down. She asked if you were good. Elias paused, one hand on the porch rail. What'd you say? I said you were. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Well, he said finally, don't go spreading rumors. Mara smiled, just a little, and took a bite of the cookie. 3 weeks after Mara's parents died, the heat broke for a single night. A storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds churning, thunder rumbling low and long across the plains. The air cooled fast, and the first drops of rain hit the dry earth like a blessing. Elias was in the barn, checking the horses, when he heard it, soft rhythmic thumping from above. He climbed the ladder and found Mara standing at the open loft door, arms outstretched, face turned up to the sky. Rain soaked her hair, her dress, ran in rivulets down her arms. She was laughing. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. You're gonna catch cold, he said. She didn't stop, didn't even look at him. Mara. It's raining, she said, breathless. It's really raining. Elias stood there, rain misting through the open door, watching her spin in slow circles, arms wide, grinning like the world had just remembered how to be kind. And for the first time in a long time, Elias Mercer felt something crack open inside his chest. Something he'd thought the sun had baked out of him years ago. He didn't tell her to come inside. He just stood there and let her dance. But the rain didn't last. By morning, the sky was white again, the earth already cracking, and the heat returned with a vengeance. And with it came the whispers, louder now, sharper, harder to ignore. Because Mara wasn't just a child anymore. She was a question. And questions, in a town like this, demanded answers. The questions started small, the way most dangerous things do. At the mercantile, over bolts of fabric and tins of tobacco. At the church steps after Sunday service, voices hushed but insistent. In the saloon, where men nursed whiskey and spoke in that particular tone reserved for other people's business that they'd decided was somehow theirs. Why was Elias Mercer keeping that girl? What were his intentions? Was it proper for an unmarried man to house a child, especially a girl, without a woman present? What would people think? The town had always been good at thinking, less good at doing. Sheriff Garvin heard the talk, same as everyone else. He tried to ignore it at first, figuring folks would move on to fresher gossip once the novelty wore off. But the heat kept pressing down, and idle minds in a drought-stricken summer had nothing better to chew on than scandal, real or imagined. So one morning, he rode out to Elias's place. He found him in the corral, working with a young mare that had been skittish since birth. Elias moved slow and deliberate, hands steady, voice low and constant. The mare's ears flicked toward him, testing, weighing whether this human was worth trusting. Garvin leaned against the fence, watching. He'd known Elias for near on 15 years, since Elias had first arrived in the territory with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a silence that suggested he'd left more than geography behind. They weren't friends exactly, but they'd built something close to respect. "She coming along?" Garvin asked. "Getting there." Elias ran a hand down the mare's neck, and she didn't flinch. Progress. "That's good." Garvin shifted his weight. "Listen, Elias, we need to talk." "So talk." "About the girl." Elias's hand stilled on the mare's withers, but he didn't turn around. "What about her?" "Folks are concerned. Folks are always concerned about something. This is different." Garvin took off his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead. "You got a child living in your barn, Elias. No legal arrangement, no family ties. People are starting to ask questions that ain't gonna just blow over." "Let them ask." "It ain't that simple." Garvin's voice hardened slightly. "There's talk of bringing it to the territorial judge, making it official. Either you file for guardianship proper, or we find her a placement back east where there's families set up for this kind of thing." Now Elias did turn, eyes sharp. "Placement. Orphanages, church homes, good places. You ever been to one of those good places, Tom?" Garvin hesitated. "No." "Then don't stand there and tell me they're good." The mare shifted nervously, sensing the tension. Elias gentled her with a touch, but his gaze stayed locked on Garvin. "She's got a roof over her head," Elias said quietly. "She's got food, water. She ain't being hurt or scared or worked to the bone. What more do people want?" "They want it proper, legal. Legal don't mean right. Maybe not, but it means protected." Garvin put his hat back on, settling it carefully. "You file for guardianship, Elias, and this all goes away. Town council backs off. Judge signs the papers. She's yours in the eyes of the law, and nobody's got grounds to interfere." Elias looked away, jaw working. "And if I don't?" "Then I got to do my job. And my job says a child without kin needs to be placed with proper authorities." Garvin's voice softened. "I don't want to do that, Elias, but I will if you force my hand." The words settled between them like stones. Elias released the mare and walked to the fence, bracing his arms against the top rail. His knuckles went white. "She chose to stay," he said finally. "She's 7 years old. She don't get to choose." "She damn well should." Garvin sighed. "I know you mean well, but this ain't about what you want or what she wants. It's about what's lawful. And right now you're standing on the wrong side of that line." Elias turned his head, looking toward the barn where Mara was probably tucked into the shade, reading one of the 3 books he owned or just sitting quiet the way she did when the heat got too fierce. "How long do I got?" he asked. "Week, maybe 2 if I can stretch it." "That's it?" "That's all I can give you." Elias nodded slowly, something settling in his expression, resignation, maybe, or determination. Hard to tell which. "All right," he said. "I'll think on it." Garvin studied him for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "Don't think too long, Elias. Clock's ticking whether you like it or not." He mounted his horse and rode back toward town, dust rising in his wake. Elias stayed at the fence, staring at nothing until the mare came up behind him and nuzzled his shoulder. He reached back and scratched her ears. "Yeah," he muttered. "I know." That evening, Elias made stew. Venison and potatoes, carrots he'd traded for at the mercantile, an onion that had seen better days but still had some life in it. He cooked it slow over the fire, letting the flavors settle, and when it was ready he ladled 2 bowls and carried them out to the porch. Mara was already there, sitting on the top step, knees drawn up, watching the sun bleed out across the horizon. He handed her a bowl and sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. They ate in silence for a while, spoons scraping against tin, cicadas starting their evening song. "You know what guardianship is?" Elias asked eventually. Mara looked at him, cautious. "No. Means someone takes legal responsibility for a child, signs papers, makes it official in the eyes of the law." She absorbed this, chewing slowly. "Like adoption?" "Similar. Not quite the same, but close enough." "Why are you telling me this?" Elias set his bowl down, hands resting on his knees. "Because the sheriff came by today. Said folks in town think it ain't proper, me keeping you here without it being legal. They want me to either file papers or let them send you east." Mara went very still. "East?" "To homes that take in children without families." "I don't want to go east." "I know. I want to stay here." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, this small, stubborn girl who'd survived things no child should have to survive, and still found reasons to smile when it rained. "Thing is," he said carefully, "filing papers means standing up in front of a judge and saying I'm fit to raise you. Means people looking into my life, asking questions, making sure I got the means and the character to do right by you." "You do?" "Maybe. But that ain't for me to decide." Mara frowned, processing. "What if they say no?" "Then I don't know what happens." She looked down at her bowl, appetite gone. "Will you try?" Elias didn't answer right away. He'd spent most of his adult life avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, the kind that tied you to people and places and expectations you couldn't walk away from when things got hard. He'd built a life that was simple, solitary, safe. But safe didn't mean good, and simple didn't mean right. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'll try." Mara's shoulders relaxed, just slightly, and she picked up her spoon again. They finished eating as the sky darkened, stars beginning to prick through the fading light. "Elias?" Mara said quietly. "Yeah?" "Thank you." He looked at her, this child who kept thanking him for things that shouldn't require gratitude, and felt that crack in his chest widen just a little more. "Finish your supper," he said gruffly. "Getting cold." She smiled, small but real, and did. But Chetan. Filing for guardianship turned out to be more complicated than Elias had anticipated. He rode into town the next day and met with a man named Howard Pierce, a lawyer who operated out of a cramped office above the barber shop. Pierce was thin and precise, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers that moved constantly, shuffling papers, making notes, adjusting his collar. "Guardianship," Pierce said, tapping his pen against the desk. "Unusual request. That a problem?" "Not inherently, but the court will want documentation, proof of stable income, character references, evidence that you're capable of providing for the child's physical and moral welfare." Elias shifted in his chair. "I got a ranch. Small, but it pays. I ain't in debt, and I keep my word." "Commendable. But you'll need witnesses willing to attest to that. People of standing in the community. I don't exactly run in those circles." Pierce smiled thinly. "Then you'll need to start." He slid a form across the desk. "Fill this out. List your assets, your income, your history. I'll need at least 3 references, preferably landowners, business proprietors, or clergy." Elias stared at the form like it was written in a foreign language. "How long does this take?" he asked. "Depends on the judge's schedule. Could be a few weeks. Could be longer. I got maybe a week before the sheriff moves forward with other arrangements." Pierce's expression shifted, something almost like sympathy flickering across his face. "Then I suggest you work quickly, Mr. Mercer." Elias took the form, folded it carefully, and stood. "What do I owe you?" "Let's start with a retainer. $5. Elias counted out the coins, set them on the desk, and left. Outside, the heat hit him like a physical blow. He stood on the boardwalk, squinting against the glare, form tucked under his arm, and wondered how the hell he was supposed to find 3 people willing to vouch for a man they barely knew. He started with the obvious choice. The church stood at the far end of town, white-clabbered with a modest steeple and a bell that hadn't rung in years due to a crack in the bronze. Reverend Martin was a kind man, soft-spoken and earnest, with a tendency to quote scripture even in casual conversation. Elias found him in the churchyard, tending to a small vegetable garden that fought a losing battle against the drought. "Elias," Martin said, straightening with a hand pressed to his lower back. "Good to see you. Been a while since you darkened our doorstep. I ain't much for church." "So I've noticed." Martin smiled. "What brings you by?" Elias explained the situation, brief, factual, without embellishment. Martin listened, hands folded, face thoughtful. "Guardianship," he repeated. "That's a serious commitment." "I know. And you're prepared for what that entails, the responsibility, the sacrifice?" "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Martin studied him for a long moment. "I'll be honest, Elias. I don't know you well. You don't attend services. You keep to yourself. I've heard you're a hard worker, an honest man, but I can't speak to your character beyond reputation." Elias's jaw tightened. "So that's a no." "I didn't say that." Martin wiped dirt from his hands. "Let me meet the girl. Let me see how she is with you, how you are with her. If what I see convinces me you're doing right by her, I'll sign your paper." It wasn't what Elias wanted, but it was more than he'd expected. "Fair enough," he said. Martin extended a hand and Elias shook it. "Bring her by Sunday," Martin said. "After service. We'll talk." Elias nodded and left, one name down, two to go. The second name was harder. Samuel Whitmore owned the largest ranch in the county, a sprawling operation with over 100 head of cattle and a reputation for shrewd business. He was also the kind of man who didn't suffer fools and didn't hand out favors without expecting something in return. Elias rode out to the Whitmore place late in the afternoon, rehearsing what he'd say, knowing it probably wouldn't matter. He was right. Whitmore met him on the porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Mercer," he said. "What can I do for you?" "Need a reference for a guardianship filing." Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "For that orphan girl you've been keeping?" "Yeah." "Why?" The bluntness caught Elias off guard. "Because she needs someone." "And you think you're that someone?" "I think I'm the one she's got." Whitmore considered this, chewing on a toothpick. "You got land?" "Enough." "You got money?" "Enough." "You got a wife?" Elias's expression darkened. "No." "Then you got a problem." Whitmore leaned against the porch rail. "Court's going to look at a single man trying to raise a girl and see all kinds of red flags. You need stability, a woman's influence. Without that, you're fighting uphill. So you won't sign." "Didn't say that either." Whitmore spat the toothpick into the dirt. "You bring that girl by, let my wife meet her. Constance has a soft spot for hard luck cases. She says yes, I'll sign. She says no, you're on your own." Elias nodded slowly. "When?" "Tomorrow evening, supper, 6 o'clock. "I'll be there." Whitmore studied him with an expression that might have been respect or might have been pity. Hard to tell. "You're either brave or stupid, Mercer," he said. "Jury's still out on which." Elias didn't dignify that with a response. He just tipped his hat and rode away. What? That night he told Mara about the meetings. She listened quietly, hands folded in her lap, face serious. "Why do they have to meet me?" she asked. "Because they need to see you're being cared for proper, that you're safe." "I am safe." "I know, but they don't. Not yet." Mara bit her lip. "What if they don't like me?" Elias looked at her, something fierce rising in his chest. "Then they're fools." She smiled a little at that. "You just be yourself," he said. "That's all anyone's got a right to ask." Mara nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that she'd somehow fail a test she didn't understand. He wanted to tell her it would be fine, that everything would work out, but he'd learned a long time ago not to make promises he couldn't keep. So instead, he said, "We'll get through it," and hoped like hell he was right. But Sunday came too fast. Elias cleaned Mara up as best he could, washed her hair in the barrel, combed out the tangles, dressed her in the least faded dress she had. She looked small and solemn, eyes wide with nervous anticipation. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands twisted the fabric of her dress. They walked to the church together, Elias in his cleanest shirt, boots polished, hat in hand. The service had just let out, and people milled around the yard, talking in clusters, children running between the wagons. Heads turned as they approached. Whispers followed. Reverend Martin saw them and waved, his smile genuine. Elias. Mara. Thank you for coming. He crouched down to Mara's level, hands on his knees. I've heard a lot about you, young lady. Mara glanced at Elias, then back at Martin. Good things? Honest things, Martin said. Which is better? He stood, gesturing toward a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. Why don't we sit and talk a bit? They sat. Mara between the two men, her feet dangling above the ground. Martin asked gentle questions about her days, what she did, how she felt. He didn't press when she hesitated, didn't force answers she wasn't ready to give. After a while, he looked at Elias. She seems well-adjusted, happy, even. She's a tough kid. She'd have to be. Martin's gaze lingered on Mara. You understand what you're taking on, Elias. This isn't temporary. Once those papers are signed, she's your responsibility, for years. I understand. And you're prepared for that? Elias looked at Mara, who was watching a butterfly land on a nearby flower, her expression soft with wonder. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm prepared. Martin was silent for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll sign. Relief flooded through Elias, sharp and unexpected. Thank you, he said. Martin smiled. Don't thank me. Thank her. She's the one who convinced me. Mara looked up, surprised. I did? You did, Martin said, just by being yourself. She beamed, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed a little lighter. The next evening, Elias and Mara rode out to the Whitmore Ranch. The house was larger than Elias's entire property, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch and windows that gleamed in the fading light. Constance Whitmore met them at the door, a handsome woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet command. You must be Mara, she said warmly. Come in, sweetheart. Supper's almost ready. The meal was elaborate by Elias's standards. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread. Constance kept the conversation light, asking Mara about her favorite things, her thoughts on the ranch, whether she liked animals. Mara answered politely, carefully, but as the meal went on, she began to relax, even laughing once when Constance told a story about a runaway pig that had terrorized the garden. Samuel Whitmore said little, but he watched, listened, noted the way Elias cut Mara's chicken without being asked, the way Mara glanced at him when she was unsure, the unspoken communication that passed between them. After supper, Constance took Mara to see the horses, leaving the men alone on the porch. Your wife's a good woman, Elias said. She is, Whitmore agreed. And she likes your girl. So you'll sign? Whitmore pulled out a cigar, lit it, took a long drag. Yeah, I'll sign. Elias exhaled, tension he hadn't realized he was carrying releasing from his shoulders. But hear me, Mercer, Whitmore continued, voice hard. You take this on, you see it through. That girl's been through enough. She don't need another person walking away. I won't. See that you don't. They stood in silence, smoke curling between them, the night settling in cool and vast. When Constance and Mara returned, Mara was smiling, cheeks flushed, talking about a mare she'd petted. Elias felt something settle in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The third reference came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Calloway from the general store appeared at Elias's door 2 days later, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. Elias blinked. For what? For judging without knowing, for listening to gossip instead of seeing what was right in front of me. She glanced past him, where Mara sat on the floor, playing with a wooden horse Elias had carved. That child's thriving. Anyone with eyes can see it, and you're the reason why. Elias didn't know what to say. I'd like to sign your reference, Mrs. Calloway continued. If you'll have me. Yeah, Elias managed. That'd be... yeah. She smiled, small but genuine, and handed him a sealed envelope. Already wrote it. Give it to your lawyer. Then she left, and Elias stood there holding 3 signatures that might just be enough to change everything. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. Elias wore his best clothes, hair slicked back, jaw freshly shaved. Mara wore a dress Constance Whitmore had given her, simple, blue, with white buttons down the front. They sat in the courthouse, a cramped room that smelled of old wood and older paper, waiting for Judge Callahan to arrive. When he did, he was a stern-faced man with white hair and eyes that missed nothing. The proceeding was brief. The lawyer presented the references. The judge read them, asked Elias a few questions about income and intent, and then turned his attention to Mara. "Young lady," he said, voice gentler than his appearance suggested, "do you want to stay with Mr. Mercer?" Mara looked at Elias, then back at the judge. "Yes, sir," she said clearly. "Why?" She thought about it, choosing her words carefully. "Because he stayed." The judge leaned back in his chair. "Stayed?" "When everyone else looked away, he stayed. When I was scared, he stayed. When I didn't know what to do, he stayed." Her voice was steady, certain. "He's good. And he's mine." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Judge Callahan's expression softened just slightly, and he looked at Elias with something that might have been approval. "Guardianship granted," he said, bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack. And just like that, everything changed. Elias walked out of that courthouse with papers in his hand that made Mara legally his, but the weight of what that meant didn't settle in until they were halfway home and she fell asleep against his shoulder in the wagon, trust so complete it made his throat tight. He'd signed his name to something permanent, something that couldn't be undone with a change of heart or a hard winter. The girl sleeping beside him wasn't just passing through anymore. She was his responsibility, his family. The word felt strange even thinking it. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what it meant to be tethered to another person's well-being, to have someone depending on him for more than a day's wage or a fair deal. But as the wagon rolled over the rutted road and Mara's weight grew heavier against him, something in Elias's chest that had been clenched tight for years finally loosened. When they reached the ranch, he carried her inside. Not to the barn, but to the house. He'd spent the previous evening clearing out the small back room that had served as storage, sweeping away dust and cobwebs, setting up a narrow bed with clean sheets and a quilt he'd found in the trunk. It wasn't much, but it was hers. He laid her down gently, pulled the quilt up to her shoulders, and stood there for a moment watching her sleep. Her face was peaceful in a way it hadn't been those first weeks, the haunted look finally fading from around her eyes. "You're mine too, kid," he said quietly, so quiet she couldn't possibly hear. "Guess we're stuck with each other now." Then he turned down the lamp and left her to rest. The next morning, Mara woke in a real bed for the first time since her parents died, and when she came out to the kitchen, Elias had breakfast waiting, eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey. She sat at the table, taking it all in with wide eyes. "This is my room now?" she asked. "Not the barn?" "That's right." "Forever?" Elias poured coffee for himself, hesitated, then poured a small cup of milk for her. "Long as you want it." Mara picked up her fork, then set it down again. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "What do I call you?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on the legal aspects, the practical concerns, that he hadn't thought about the emotional architecture they'd need to build. "What do you want to call me?" he asked. She considered this seriously. "Are you my father now?" In the eyes of the law, something close to it. "But not my real father." "No, your real father was the man who raised you before. I can't replace him, and I won't try." Mara nodded slowly, processing. "Can I just keep calling you Elias?" "That works fine." She smiled with relief and picked up her fork again. "Okay, good." They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, and if anyone had looked through the window, they would have seen something that looked almost ordinary. A man and a child sharing a meal, starting a day like any other. But ordinary was a miracle when you'd been expecting nothing at all. The town's reaction to the guardianship was mixed. Some folks, like Reverend Martin and the Whitmores, offered congratulations and genuine support. Others remained skeptical, their doubts dressed up as concern. A few simply couldn't let go of the impropriety of it all. A single man raising a young girl, no matter what papers he had. Elias heard the whispers but ignored them. He'd never lived his life for other people's approval, and he wasn't about to start now. What he didn't ignore was the moment, 3 weeks after the hearing, when he came back from checking fence lines and found Mara gone. The house was empty. The barn was empty. He called her name, voice sharp with rising panic, and got only silence in return. He searched the immediate property, then widened his circle, pulse hammering against his ribs. The sun was fierce overhead, and all he could think about was her parents collapsing in heat just like this, dying while she sat helpless beside them. He found her tracks leading east, toward the ridge where the Hutchinsons' wagon had been found. His stomach dropped. He saddled his horse and rode hard, following the small footprints in the dust. The landscape out here was unforgiving, rocky outcroppings, sparse vegetation, rattlesnakes sunning themselves on flat stones. Not a place for a child alone. He found her exactly where he feared he would. The broken wagon was still there, weathered and half collapsed, a stark monument to bad luck and worse timing. Mara sat beside it in the dirt, knees pulled to her chest, face buried in her arms. Elias dismounted slowly, approaching the way he would a spooked horse. Mara. She didn't look up. He crouched beside her, close enough to touch but giving her space. The ground here was hard-packed, scattered with the remnants of the Hutchinsons' belongings. A cracked water barrel, a torn canvas cover, a child's rag doll half buried in sand. "You remember this place," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She nodded against her knees. "That why you came out here?" Another nod. Elias sat down fully, settling in beside her. The heat pressed down merciless, but he didn't rush her. He'd learned patience from horses and hardship both. "I wanted to say goodbye," Mara whispered finally. "Proper goodbye. I never got to before." "I understand." "Do you?" She lifted her head, and her face was streaked with dust and tears. "Everyone keeps saying I'm fine now, that I'm safe, that everything's better, and it is, but—" Her voice cracked. "But they're still gone. And I'm still here, and sometimes that feels wrong." Elias felt something twist inside him. He'd known grief himself, known the guilt that came with surviving when others didn't. He'd just never had to explain it to a 7-year-old. "It's not wrong," he said carefully. "It's just hard. There's a difference." "It doesn't feel different." "I know." He picked up a small stone, turned it over in his hand. "When I was younger, I lost people too. People I cared about. And for a long time, I thought the best way to honor them was to stop caring about anyone else. Figured if I kept myself separate, kept moving, I wouldn't have to feel that hurt again." Mara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Did it work?" "For a while. But it's a lonely way to live." He tossed the stone aside. "Your parents wouldn't want that for you. They'd want you to keep going, keep growing, keep finding reasons to be happy." "How do you know?" "Because that's what love is. Wanting the people you care about to have good lives, even when you can't be there to see it." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the broken wagon. Then she said, very softly, "I miss them so much." "I know you do. Will it always hurt like this?" Elias considered lying, offering the kind of easy comfort adults sometimes gave children to make them feel better. But Mara deserved more than that. "Yeah," he said, "it probably will. But you learn to carry it different. It gets less sharp, less heavy. You figure out how to keep them with you without letting the grief take over everything else." Mara leaned against him then, a small weight against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her. They sat there for a long time, two people who'd both lost more than anyone should have to lose, finding something like peace in the shade of a broken wagon and the truth between them. Eventually, Elias stood and offered her his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." Mara looked up at him, eyes red but clear. "Okay." She took his hand and he pulled her to her feet. Then he did something he'd never done before. He lifted her up and set her in the saddle, climbing up behind her. "We'll come back sometime if you want," he said. "Bring flowers or something. Make it a proper memorial." "I'd like that." He turned the horse toward home and Mara settled back against him, safe and solid. Behind them, the broken wagon stood silent in the heat, and the ghosts it held watched them go. After that day, something shifted between them. Mara stopped testing whether Elias would leave, stopped holding herself at a careful distance. She started asking for things, small things at first, like could she help with chores? Could she learn to ride? Could she sit with him on the porch in the evenings? Elias said yes to all of it. He taught her to curry the horses, to mend fence, to recognize the signs of weather changing. He wasn't particularly good with words, but he was good with showing, and Mara learned fast. She also started talking more. About her parents, about memories she'd been afraid to touch. Elias listened without trying to fix anything, and slowly those memories became less like wounds and more like treasures she could take out and examine without bleeding. But not everyone was content to let them build this fragile peace. The trouble came from a direction Elias hadn't anticipated. 6 weeks after the guardianship was granted, a man arrived in town asking questions. His name was Robert Hutchinson, and he claimed to be Mara's uncle, her father's younger brother, traveling from back east after finally receiving word of his brother's death. Elias first heard about it from Garvin, who rode out to the ranch looking grim. "We got a problem," the sheriff said without preamble. Elias was shoeing a horse, and he didn't stop working. "What kind of problem?" "The kind with a blood claim and a lawyer." Now Elias did stop. He straightened, hammer in hand, and looked at Garvin. "Explain." "Man named Robert Hutchinson showed up yesterday. Says he's Mara's uncle. Says he's got a right to her." Elias's grip tightened on the hammer. "She's got guardianship papers, legal and filed." "I know, and I told him that. But he's claiming that blood relation supersedes guardianship, especially when the guardian's not even a family friend." Garvin took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair. "He's filed a petition with the territorial court, wants the guardianship overturned." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Elias set the hammer down with careful precision. "He have a legitimate claim?" he asked. "According to his lawyer, yeah. If he can prove kinship and demonstrate he's fit, the court might rule in his favor." "Where is he now?" "Staying at the boarding house. Asked to meet with Mara tomorrow." "Absolutely not. Elias, you can't refuse." "Watch me." Garvin's expression hardened. "You do that, and it looks like you're hiding something. Like you know your claim won't hold up under scrutiny. You want to fight this, you got to be smart about it." Elias stared at him, jaw clenched so tight it ached. "What are you suggesting?" "Let him meet her, supervised, on your property if that makes you feel better. Let him make his case and let Mara see who he is. Then when it goes before the judge, she can speak for herself same as she did before." "And if she chooses him?" The question came out rough, and Garvin's expression softened. "You really think she will?" Elias didn't answer. That evening, he sat Mara down and told her about her uncle. She listened without interrupting, face pale but composed. "Do I have to go with him?" she asked when he finished. "No, not unless a judge says so, and even then I'll fight it. But he's family, real family." "So am I now," Elias said firmly. "Papers say so. But more than that, I was here. I stayed. That counts for something." Mara twisted her hands in her lap. "What if he's nice?" "Then that's good. You deserve to know your family." "But what if he wants to take me away?" Elias reached out and took her hands, stilling them. "Then we'll deal with it, together. But Mara, listen to me. No matter what happens, you get a say in this. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you different." She nodded, but her eyes were bright with fear. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "I know. I want to stay here with you." Something in Elias's chest cracked wide open. He pulled her into a hug, awkward but fierce, and felt her arms wrapped tight around his neck. "Then we'll make sure that happens," he said into her hair. "I promise." It was the first promise he'd made her, and he meant every word. Robert Hutchinson arrived the next afternoon driving a rented buggy, dressed in a suit that marked him as city folk despite the dust of travel. He was younger than Elias expected, maybe 30, with his brother's eyes and a careful smile. Elias met him in the yard, Mara standing slightly behind him. "Mr. Mercer," Hutchinson said, extending a hand, "thank you for agreeing to meet." Elias shook it briefly. Didn't have much choice. "I suppose not." Hutchinson's gaze shifted to Mara, and his expression softened. Hello, Mara. I'm your Uncle Robert, your father's brother. Mara didn't respond, fingers gripping the back of Elias's shirt. Hutchinson crouched down to her level, still smiling. You probably don't remember me. You were very young when I left for Boston, but I remember you. You had your mother's eyes even then. What do you want? Mara asked quietly. The bluntness seemed to catch him off guard. I want to get to know you, to make sure you're all right. I'm fine. I'm glad to hear it. But when I received word about your parents, about what happened, his voice caught, genuine emotion flickering across his face. I came as soon as I could. I couldn't let you grow up alone, not when you have family who cares about you. She's not alone, Elias said flatly. Hutchinson stood, and some of the warmth left his expression. Mr. Mercer, I appreciate what you've done for Mara. I truly do. But I'm her blood. Her father would have wanted her with family. Her father would have wanted her safe and happy. She's both. With a stranger, I'm not a stranger anymore. They stared at each other, tension thick between them. Mara stepped forward slightly. Can I ask you something? Hutchinson's attention snapped back to her. Of course. Where were you when Mama and Papa died? He blinked. I was in Boston. I didn't know. It's been almost 3 months. It took time for the letter to reach me. And then I had to settle my affairs, arrange travel. Elias was here the next day, Mara said simply. He gave me food and water and a place to sleep. He didn't wait for letters or arrangements. He just stayed. Hutchinson's jaw tightened. Mara, I understand you're grateful to Mr. Mercer, but gratitude isn't the same as family. I can give you a real home, education, opportunities you won't have out here in the middle of nowhere. This is my home. It's a ranch in the desert. It's my home, she repeated, louder now. And Elias is my family. The papers say so. Papers can be changed. Elias stepped forward, putting himself between Hutchinson and Mara. I think it's time for you to go. Hutchinson's expression hardened. This isn't over, Mercer. No, I don't suppose it is. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and then Hutchinson turned and walked back to his buggy. He climbed up, took the reins, and looked back one last time. I'll see you in court, he said. Then he drove away, leaving dust and tension in his wake. Mara moved to stand beside Elias, watching the buggy disappear down the road. He seemed sad, she said quietly. Maybe he is. Does that mean he's right? Elias looked down at her. No, it just means this is complicated. I don't want complicated. I just want to stay here. Then that's what we'll fight for. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood there together until the dust settled and the world was quiet again. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and those 2 weeks felt like standing on the edge of a cliff waiting for the ground to give way. Elias consulted with Pierce, who was less optimistic than he'd been before. Blood relation is powerful in the eyes of the law, Pierce explained, especially when it's a direct uncle. If Hutchinson can demonstrate stable income, good character, and suitable living arrangements, the judge may rule that Mara belongs with him. Even if she doesn't want that? Her wishes will be considered, but she's a child. The court ultimately decides what's in her best interest. And they think her best interest is being dragged back east to live with a man she doesn't know? Pierce's expression was sympathetic but firm. They might think her best interest is being raised by blood family in a city with schools and churches and society. You're fighting perception as much as law here, Elias. Elias left that meeting feeling like he was drowning. He threw himself into work, mending things that didn't need mending, writing fence lines until his horse was exhausted. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling. Mara noticed. She always noticed. One evening, she found him in the barn, working on a saddle that was already perfectly functional. You're worried, she said. I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. Despite everything, Elias almost smiled. When'd you get so smart? I've always been smart. You just weren't paying attention. She sat down on a hay bale, watching him work. The light was fading, golden and soft, through the barn door. Elias? Yeah? If the judge says I have to go with Uncle Robert, will you let me? His hand stilled on the leather. If that's what the law says, I won't have a choice. But would you let me? Really? He set the saddle down and turned to face her fully. No. I'd fight it every way I knew how. I'd appeal. I'd petition. I'd make so much noise they'd have no choice but to listen. And if none of that worked? The question hung between them, terrible and necessary. Then I'd make sure you knew you always had a home here, Elias said quietly. That no matter where you were, no matter how far away, you could always come back. And I'd be waiting. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. You promise? I promise. She stood and crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He held her tight, this small, fierce girl who'd chosen him against all logic and reason, and prayed to a deity he wasn't sure he believed in that he wouldn't have to let her go. The day of the hearing arrived with cloudless skies and suffocating heat. Elias and Mara sat on one side of the courtroom, Hutchinson and his lawyer on the other. Judge Callahan presided, looking no more pleased to be there than anyone else. Hutchinson's lawyer spoke first, laying out his client's claim with practiced efficiency. Robert Hutchinson was blood family. He had steady employment as a clerk in Boston, respectable lodgings, and connections to ensure Mara received proper schooling and moral guidance. He had traveled considerable distance and expense to claim his niece, demonstrating commitment and care. Pierce countered by emphasizing the existing guardianship, the stability Mara had found with Elias, the trauma of uprooting her again. He called Reverend Martin and Constance Whitmore as character witnesses, both of whom spoke eloquently about Elias's integrity and Mara's well-being. But the strongest testimony came from Mara herself. Judge Callahan called her forward, and she walked to the witness stand with her head high, small hands gripping the rail. Mara, the judge said gently, I need you to answer some questions honestly. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Do you understand that Mr. Hutchinson is your uncle, your father's brother? Yes, sir. And he wants to take you back to Boston to live with him. Do you understand that too? Yes, sir. How does that make you feel? Mara was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Scared. Why scared? Because I don't know him, and Boston isn't home. Hutchinson leaned forward, face earnest. Mara, I know we're strangers now, but we're family. I can give you things Mr. Mercer can't. Education, culture, a future beyond this desert. Mara looked at him directly. Elias gave me something you didn't. What's that? He gave me water when I was dying of thirst. He gave me shade when the heat was killing me. He gave me a place to grieve and time to heal. He didn't wait for letters or make excuses. He just stayed. Her voice was steady, clear. Blood didn't do that. He did. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Judge Callahan leaned back, studying her with an unreadable expression. You love him, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. And you want to stay with him? More than anything. The judge looked at Elias, then at Hutchinson, then back at Mara. This court will recess for 1 hour while I consider my ruling, he said. The gavel came down, and everyone stood. Elias met Mara at the gate, and she collapsed against him, shaking. You did good, he murmured. Real good. What if it's not enough? Then we'll figure something out. But you did everything right. They waited outside, Elias pacing while Mara sat on a bench, hands folded. The hours stretched like taffy, endless and excruciating. When they were finally called back in, Elias's heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. Judge Callahan looked tired. This is not an easy decision, he began. Mr. Hutchinson has a legitimate claim, and his intentions appear genuine. Under normal circumstances, blood relation would carry significant weight. Elias felt his stomach drop. However, the judge continued, these are not normal circumstances. This child has already endured tremendous loss and upheaval. She has found stability, safety, and most importantly, a voice. And when given the opportunity to speak, she has spoken clearly. He looked at Hutchinson. Sir, I believe you care for your niece, but care from a distance is not the same as showing up in the moment of crisis. Mr. Mercer did that, and in doing so, he earned something that cannot be legislated or overruled. The judge's gavel rose. The existing guardianship will stand. Mara remains with Elias Mercer. The gavel fell, and the world rushed back in all at once, Sound, light, air. Mara turned and threw her arms around Elias's neck, and he held her so tight he was afraid he might break her, but she just held on tighter. "We won," she whispered. "We won." "Yeah, kid," he said, voice rough. "We did." Across the courtroom, Robert Hutchinson stood slowly. For a moment, Elias thought he might protest, might fight. But instead, he just looked at Mara with something like resignation and sorrow. "Be happy," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked out. And just like that, it was over. They rode home in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, not heavy with dread, but light with relief. Fragile as new glass. Mara sat beside Elias in the wagon, her hand resting on the seat between them, and every few minutes he'd glance over just to make sure she was really there, really his, really staying. The sun was beginning its descent when they pulled into the yard, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Elias helped Mara down, and she stood there for a moment looking at the house, the barn, the fence line stretching toward the horizon. "It looks different," she said. "It's the same as it was this morning." "No," she shook her head. "It looks like home now, really home." Elias felt something catch in his throat. He'd owned this land for near on 8 years, worked it through droughts and harsh winters, built every fence post and patched every leak. But it had never been more than a place to him, a roof, a purpose, a way to keep moving forward without having to think too hard about where he'd been. Now, watching Mara walk toward the porch like she belonged there, he understood the difference between a place and a home. She turned back to him, squinting against the low sun. "Can we have supper outside tonight? On the porch?" "If you want." "I want." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made the last 3 months of worry and fighting feel worth every second. "I'll set the table." She disappeared inside, and Elias stood there in the yard listening to the sounds of her moving through the house. Footsteps, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of plates. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, the kind he'd gotten used to without realizing it. He unhitched the horse, led it to the barn, and took his time with the brushing and feeding, letting the familiar motions settle him. The fear that had been coiled tight in his chest for weeks was finally starting to unwind, but it left behind an exhaustion he hadn't anticipated. When he came back to the house, Mara had set 2 places at the small table on the porch, tin cups and plates arranged carefully. A jar of wildflowers she must have picked earlier sitting in the center. "When'd you do that?" he asked, gesturing to the flowers. "This morning, before we left. I thought—" She paused, suddenly uncertain. "I thought if we came home, I wanted it to feel like celebrating." Elias looked at those flowers, scraggly things, half wilted from the heat, nothing special, and felt his eyes burn. "It does," he said quietly. "It feels exactly like that." They ate beans and cornbread as the sky turned purple and the first stars pricked through the darkness. Cicadas sang their endless song, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out, lonely and wild. Mara pushed beans around her plate, eating slowly, thoughtfully. "Do you think Uncle Robert was sad?" she asked eventually. Elias considered the question. He could have lied, could have told her not to worry about it, but they'd built something on honesty, and he wasn't about to undermine that now. "Probably," he said. "Losing family's hard, even when you didn't know them well. I feel bad for him." "That's because you got a good heart." She looked up at him. "Is it wrong that I'm glad the judge said no, that I didn't have to go?" "No. It ain't wrong to want to stay where you feel safe." "But what if he needed me? What if he was lonely?" Elias set down his fork and turned to face her fully. "Mara, listen to me. You're 7 years old. It ain't your job to fix grown folks' loneliness or make them feel better about choices they made. Your uncle's a grown man. He'll figure out his own life. You just focus on being a kid. But no buts. You get to be selfish about this. You get to choose what's best for you. That's not cruel. That's survival." She thought about this, chewing her lip. "Did you ever have to choose like that? Between what someone else needed and what you needed?" Elias went very still. The question hit closer than she probably realized, dragging up memories he'd spent years trying to bury. "Yeah," he said finally, "I did." What happened? He looked out at the darkening land, jaw tight. I chose wrong. Stayed when I should have left. Tried to fix something that was already broken beyond repair. By the time I figured that out, I'd lost more than I could afford to lose. Is that why you came here, to Wyoming? Part of it. Mara was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm glad you came here. Even if it was because of something sad. Elias glanced at her, this small girl with eyes too old for her years and a capacity for grace he didn't entirely understand. Me too, kid, he said. Me too. They finished eating as full dark settled in, and when Mara started nodding off in her chair, Elias sent her to bed. He cleaned up the dishes, banked the fire, and stood on the porch for a long time listening to the night. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow they'd start fresh. Tomorrow the fear would be gone and they could just be what they were. A man and a girl learning how to be family. But tomorrow came with complications he hadn't anticipated. The town, having watched the legal battle with intense interest, now seemed divided on what the outcome meant. Some folks nodded approvingly when they saw Elias and Mara together, treating the judge's decision as vindication. Others whispered that blood should have won out, that there was something unnatural about a bachelor rancher raising a little girl. Legal papers be damned. Elias ignored it all, same as he always had. But Mara, who was more attuned to social currents than he'd given her credit for, started to notice. A week after the hearing, she came home from town where Elias had left her with Mrs. Calloway while he picked up lumber, and her face was troubled. What happened? He asked. Nothing. Mara, she sighed. Some ladies were talking, at the store. They didn't know I could hear them. Elias's jaw tightened. What'd they say? That you only kept me because you felt guilty, that I'd be better off with real family, that the judge made a mistake. She looked up at him, eyes searching. Did he? Make a mistake? No. How do you know? Because you're still smiling. Because you sleep through the night now. Because when you talk about the future, you sound like you believe in it. He crouched down to her level. Those ladies don't know a damn thing about what we got here, and their opinion don't change the facts. What are the facts? That you're mine, and I'm yours, and anyone who's got a problem with that can take it up with Judge Callahan. Mara smiled a little at that. You sound mad. I am mad, but not at you. She threw her arms around his neck, sudden and fierce, and he held her close. I don't care what they say, she whispered. I know where I belong. Good. Don't forget it. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they intensified as the weeks passed and it became clear that Elias and Mara weren't going anywhere. Some of it was genuine concern, twisted by gossip into something uglier. Some of it was boredom looking for a target. And some of it was the simple human tendency to distrust anything that didn't fit neatly into expected categories. A man and a girl, unrelated by blood, living alone on a ranch. It made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't always articulate, so they filled the silence with speculation. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning 6 weeks after the hearing. Elias had started taking Mara to church semi-regularly, mostly because Reverend Martin had asked, and it seemed like a small price to pay for the man's support during the guardianship fight. They'd sit in the back, Mara in a clean dress and Elias in his least-worn shirt, and listen to Martin's sermons about grace and redemption and loving your neighbor. This particular Sunday, they arrived a few minutes late and had to squeeze into a pew near the middle. The service proceeded normally, hymns, prayers, a sermon about the Good Samaritan that Elias thought was a bit on the nose given recent events. But after the service, as people milled around outside in the heat, a woman named Margaret Hastings approached them with her 2 daughters in tow. Margaret was the wife of a prominent rancher, a woman who'd always carried herself with the certainty of someone who knew exactly how the world should work and felt personally affronted when it didn't comply. Elias, she said, voice pitched to Carrie, might I have a word? Mrs. Hastings. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I've been meaning to speak with you about your situation. What situation's that? The girl. She glanced at Mara with something that might have been pity or might have been disdain, hard to tell. I understand the judge ruled in your favor, but surely you can see the impropriety of the arrangement. Elias went very still. No, ma'am. I can't. A young girl needs a woman's influence, guidance in matters of, well, matters that a man simply cannot provide. Mara's doing fine. For now, perhaps. But as she grows older, questions will arise. Questions about decency and reputation. Margaret's voice dropped to a conspiratorial tone that somehow managed to be even louder. People talk, Elias, and what they're saying isn't kind. Let them talk. It's not about you, it's about her. Margaret looked at Mara again. A girl's reputation is her most valuable asset. If she grows up in circumstances that invite speculation, it could damage her prospects considerably. Mara, who'd been standing quietly beside Elias, spoke up. What prospects? Margaret blinked, caught off guard. I beg your pardon? You said it could damage my prospects. What prospects? Well, marriage, respectability, a place in society. Mara frowned. I'm 7. Which is exactly why these foundations matter now. Mrs. Hastings, Elias said, voice dangerously quiet, I appreciate your concern, but Mara's prospects ain't your business. I'm simply trying to help. No, ma'am, you're trying to feel important by meddling in things that don't concern you. He took Mara's hand. We're done here. He turned to leave, but Margaret wasn't finished. You can't protect her from everything, Elias, she called after them. Sooner or later, she'll have to face the consequences of your choices. Elias stopped, turned back, and in a voice that carried across the churchyard said, the only consequence she's facing is having someone who gives a damn whether she lives or dies. If that bothers you, I suggest you examine why. Then he walked away, Mara's hand tight in his, while the congregation watched in stunned silence. They didn't speak on the ride home. Mara stared at her hands, and Elias stared at the road, anger simmering just below the surface. When they reached the ranch, Mara climbed down from the wagon and went straight to the barn. Elias watched her go, gave her a few minutes, then followed. He found her in the loft, sitting in the same spot where she'd slept those first few weeks, knees pulled to her chest. You all right? He asked from the ladder. Did I ruin your reputation? Elias climbed up and sat beside her. What? Mrs. Hastings said people are talking, that keeping me makes you look bad. I don't give a damn how I look. But what if she's right? What if people stop doing business with you because of me? What if... Stop. Elias put a hand on her shoulder. Listen to me. Whatever people want to say, whatever gossip they want to spread, it don't change nothing between us, you understand? Nothing. But no, there's no future where I regret choosing you. There's no version of this where I wish I'd walked away. So stop trying to make yourself responsible for other people's smallness. Mara's eyes filled with tears. I just don't want you to lose things because of me. The only thing I'd lose is you, and that ain't happening. She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. What Mrs. Hastings said, Mara murmured, about me needing a woman's influence, is that true? Elias sighed. Probably some truth to it. There's things I can't teach you, things I don't know about being a woman in this world. So what do? We figure it out, same as we figure out everything else. They sat there in the dusty quiet of the barn, and Elias made a decision. 2 days later, he rode out to the Whitmore Ranch. Constance was in her garden, working despite the heat, wide-brimmed hat shading her face. She looked up as Elias approached, wiping dirt from her hands. Elias, this is a pleasant surprise. Mrs. Whitmore, got a minute? Of course. She gestured to a bench in the shade. What's on your mind? Elias sat, turning his hat in his hands. I need advice. About Mara. Constance's expression softened. What kind of advice? The kind I ain't qualified to give. About growing up. Being a girl in a world that judges her for things she can't control. He met her eyes. I know how to teach her to work hard and think straight and stand up for herself, but there's whole parts of life I don't understand, parts she's going to need help with. Constance was quiet for a moment, then smiled gently. You're asking if I'll help guide her. If you're willing. Oh, Elias, I'd be honored. Relief flooded through him. I can't pay much. I don't want your money. I want to help that girl thrive. Constance leaned forward. Bring her by once a week. We'll have tea, work on lessons, talk about whatever's on her mind. She can learn things from me that you can't teach her, and that's all right. It doesn't make you any less her father. The word hit him square in the chest. Father. He'd been avoiding it, dancing around it, calling himself her guardian because it felt safer, less presumptuous. I ain't her father, he said quietly. Aren't you? Constance raised an eyebrow. What do you call someone who feeds a child, shelters her, fights for her, worries about her future, and loves her enough to admit when he needs help? Elias didn't have an answer for that. Bring her Thursday afternoon, Constance said. We'll start then. He nodded, throat tight. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. That girl's lucky to have you. When Elias told Mara about the arrangement, she was nervous at first, worried it meant she wasn't good enough as she was. But he explained it the way Constance had framed it, not as fixing something broken, but as adding tools to help her build the life she wanted. The first Thursday, Mara came home with flour on her dress and a smile on her face, talking a mile a minute about learning to make biscuits and discussing books and hearing stories about Constance's own childhood. She said I remind her of herself at my age, Mara said, eyes bright. Stubborn and curious and too smart for my own good. Sounds about right, Elias said, and Mara laughed. The visits became a routine, and slowly something shifted. Mara started carrying herself with a new kind of confidence, like she was building an identity beyond just the orphan who'd survived, beyond the girl people whispered about. She was becoming someone in her own right, sharp and thoughtful and fiercely loyal. And Elias, watching her grow, felt something he'd thought died years ago stirring back to life. Pride. Summer bled into fall, and with the change in seasons came a change in the town's attitude. Not everyone, certainly. There were still those who looked at Elias and Mara with suspicion or judgment. But slowly, grudgingly, most folks started to accept them. Maybe it was seeing Mara thrive. Maybe it was Constance Whitmore's quiet endorsement. Maybe it was just time wearing down resistance the way water wears down stone. Whatever the reason, the whispers faded to background noise, and life settled into something almost ordinary. Elias taught Mara to ride properly, graduating her from sitting in front of him to her own saddle on the gentler mare. She took to it like she'd been born on horseback, fearless and laughing when the mare kicked into a canter. He taught her to shoot, starting with tin cans lined up on fence posts, showing her how to breathe, how to steady her hands, how to respect the weight of what she was holding. Why do I need to know this? She asked. Because out here, you can't always wait for someone to protect you. You need to be able to protect yourself. She nodded seriously and practiced until her arms shook, until she could hit the cans more often than not. He taught her to read weather in the sky, to sense when the wind was shifting, to know by the feel of the air when rain was coming or when the heat would break. And in return, she taught him things he hadn't known he needed to learn. She taught him that laughter wasn't frivolous, that joy in small things. A bird's nest, a perfect sunset, cookies fresh from the oven wasn't weakness. She taught him that talking about hard things didn't make them worse, that sometimes the only way through grief was straight down the middle of it. She taught him that being needed wasn't a burden, it was a gift. One evening in late October, with the air finally cooling and the leaves on the cottonwood starting to turn, Mara came out to the porch where Elias was repairing a bridle. Can I ask you something? She said. Always. Do you ever miss being alone? The question surprised him. He set down the leather and looked at her. No, he said honestly. Why? You worried I do? Sometimes I think about how quiet it must have been before, how you could do whatever you wanted without having to think about anyone else. She picked at a splinter on the porch rail. And I wonder if maybe you miss that. Elias was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It was quiet, he said finally, and I could do what I wanted, but you know what I couldn't do? What? Matter. I worked and ate and slept, and none of it meant anything beyond just existing. There was no one to notice if I did good work or made something beautiful or had a hard day. He looked at her. You changed that. Now when I fix something, you see it. When I make supper, you're there to share it. When I have a hard day, there's someone who gives a damn. Mara smiled, small and soft. I give a damn. I know you do, and that's worth more than all the quiet in the world. She moved closer and leaned against him, and he put an arm around her shoulders. Elias? Yeah? I'm glad we found each other. Me too, kid. Me too. They sat there as the sun went down and the stars came out, two people who'd been broken by the same merciless heat and found in each other something worth rebuilding for. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to look forward to. Winter came to Wyoming with the kind of cold that settled into your bones and didn't let go. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the harsh brown landscape into something softer, quieter, almost gentle. Mara stood at the window watching it come down, her breath fogging the glass, wonder written across her face. "You ever seen snow before?" Elias asked from the stove where he was making coffee. "Once, when I was really small, but I don't remember it much." "Well, you're about to get real familiar with it. We got months of this ahead." She turned to him, eyes bright. "Can we go out in it?" "After breakfast. Got chores to do first." But she was already pulling on the coat he'd bought her in town. Too big still, but she'd grow into it, and the boots that Constance had passed down from her own daughters. She looked up at him with such pure anticipation that he couldn't help but smile. "All right," he relented. "Chores can wait a bit." They went out into the yard together, and Mara spun in circles with her face tilted up, catching snowflakes on her tongue. Elias watched her, this child who'd known such darkness, and still managed to find joy in something as simple as falling snow, and felt something in his chest expand until it almost hurt. She bent down and scooped up a handful of snow, packing it experimentally. "Elias?" "Yeah?" The snowball hit him square in the chest. He looked down at the white splatter on his coat, then up at her. She was grinning, already backing away. "You know what you just started?" he asked. "Maybe." He bent down and gathered his own ammunition, and for the next 20 minutes they engaged in a battle that left them both soaked and breathless and laughing harder than either had in months. When they finally called a truce, they were both red-cheeked and panting, and the world felt lighter than it had any right to be. That winter proved harder than the summer in different ways. The cold was relentless, the work never-ending. There were frozen water troughs to break, animals to feed and shelter, firewood to split and stack. But they fell into a rhythm, Elias and Mara working side by side, learning each other's patterns and strengths. Mara proved tougher than her small frame suggested. She didn't complain about the cold or the early mornings or the blisters on her hands from helping split wood. She just did what needed doing, the way someone does when they understand that survival depends on pulling your own weight. But there were hard days, too. Days when the cold seemed to seep into everything and make the world feel impossibly bleak. Days when Mara would go quiet and distant, and Elias would find her staring at nothing, lost in memories she didn't share. On one of those days, near Christmas, Elias came in from feeding the horses to find her sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, writing slowly. "What's that?" he asked, stamping snow from his boots. She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "A letter." "To who?" "Mama and Papa." Her voice was small. "I know they can't read it. I know they're gone. But Constance said sometimes it helps to write things down anyway, to say the things you didn't get to say." Elias hung his coat on the peg and sat down across from her. "What are you telling them? That I'm okay? That I found someone who takes care of me? That I miss them, but I'm not stuck anymore?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Is that stupid?" "No, that's brave." "It doesn't feel brave. It feels sad." "Sometimes those are the same thing." She nodded and went back to writing, and Elias sat with her in the quiet warmth of the house while the snow piled up outside and the grief did what grief does, took up space, demanded acknowledgement, and slowly began to settle into something she could carry without it crushing her. When she finished the letter, she folded it carefully and held it in both hands. "What do I do with it now?" she asked. "Whatever feels right." She thought for a moment, then stood and walked to the fireplace. She looked back at him once, checking, and he nodded. She placed the letter on the flames and watched it catch and curl and turn to ash, her lips moving silently. When it was gone, she came back to the table and climbed into his lap, something she hadn't done in weeks, being conscious of growing older and what that meant. "I'm glad I have you," she whispered against his shoulder. Elias held her close, This child who was becoming his in ways that had nothing to do with papers or courts or blood. "I'm glad I have you too," he said. Christmas came quiet and simple. Elias had never been one for celebration, but he made an effort for Mara's sake. He cut a small pine from the property and set it up in the corner of the main room. Mara strung popcorn and dried berries to decorate it, and Constance had sent over a few glass ornaments that caught the firelight and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. On Christmas morning, Elias gave Mara a doll that Constance had helped him pick out: cloth body, porcelain face, yellow yarn hair. Mara clutched it like it was made of gold. "She's beautiful," Mara breathed. "You like her?" "I love her." She looked up at him. "I didn't get you anything. You being here is enough." "That doesn't count." "Sure it does." But later that day, after they'd eaten a modest Christmas dinner and were sitting by the fire, Mara pulled something from her pocket and handed it to him shyly. It was a piece of leather, tooled carefully with a simple pattern. Nothing fancy, but the work was neat and obviously done with great care. "It's for your saddle," she said, "or your bridle. Wherever you want to put it. Constance showed me how to do the tooling." Elias turned it over in his hands, running his thumb across the pattern. His throat felt tight. "This is real fine work," he managed. "You really think so?" "I know so." He looked at her. "Thank you, Mara." She beamed, and that night when he went to bed, he placed the leather piece on the small table beside his bed, where he could see it first thing in the morning. The winter stretched long, but they made it through. And when spring finally came, green pushing up through melting snow, it felt like a promise kept, that they could survive the hard seasons together and come out the other side intact. But just as the world was thawing, a letter arrived that threatened to freeze everything solid again. Sheriff Garvin delivered it personally, riding out to the ranch on a gray morning in early March. Elias saw him coming and felt his stomach drop. "Tom," he said as the sheriff dismounted. "What brings you out?" Garvin pulled an envelope from his coat. "Got a letter forwarded through the territorial office. Figured I should bring it myself." Elias took it, recognizing the official seal. "What is it?" "Don't know. Didn't open your mail." But Garvin's expression was troubled. "Though if I had to guess, it's got something to do with Robert Hutchinson." Elias tore it open and read quickly, his jaw tightening with every line. It was a petition from Hutchinson, filed through a Boston court, requesting periodic visitation rights as Mara's uncle. The petition argued that while the Wyoming court had granted guardianship to Elias, family connection still warranted some form of contact and relationship. "Damn it," Elias muttered. "What's it say?" "He wants visitation. Says blood relation gives him the right." Garvin sighed. "That's sticky. He might have legal ground to stand on, especially if he can get a sympathetic judge. After everything? After losing in court? After leaving, he's coming back for more?" "Looks that way." Elias crumpled the letter in his fist, anger surging hot. "What do I do?" "You respond. Through your lawyer. Make your case why visitation isn't in Mara's best interest." Garvin paused. "Or you consider that maybe it is." Elias stared at him. "You think I should let him near her?" "I think," Garvin said carefully, "that if you fight this too hard, it might make things worse. Courts don't like it when guardians try to cut off all contact with blood family. Makes them look controlling, unreasonable. I'm trying to protect her." "I know. But sometimes protecting means compromising." Garvin put a hand on his shoulder. "Talk to Pierce. See what he says. But Elias, think hard before you dig in. You won this fight once. Might not be so lucky twice." After Garvin left, Elias stood in the yard holding that crumpled letter and feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him just when he'd thought it was solid. He didn't tell Mara right away. He rode into town the next day and met with Pierce, who read the petition with a frown. "He's not wrong about having some legal standing," Pierce said. "Blood relation does typically warrant consideration for visitation, especially with a minor child." "Even when she doesn't want to see him?" "That'll matter, but she's still a child. The court decides what's in her best interest, and maintaining family connection is generally viewed favorably." Elias felt trapped. "So what are my options?" "You can fight it. Argue that Hutchinson abandoned his claim when he lost the guardianship case, that forcing visitation would be disruptive and harmful to Mara's stability. Pierce paused. Or you can negotiate terms. Limited visitation, supervised on your property. Give a little to protect what you've got. I don't want to give anything. I understand, but consider this. If you fight and lose, the court might impose visitation terms you have no control over. If you negotiate now, you set the boundaries. Elias hated it, hated all of it, but he saw the logic. What do you recommend? Propose supervised visits quarterly on your ranch, 2 hours each time. You present with the right to end the visit if Mara becomes distressed. Pierce looked at him over his glasses. It shows good faith, protects Mara, and gives you control over the situation. And if I say no to all of it, then we go to court, and I honestly can't promise we'll win. Elias left that meeting feeling defeated in a way he hadn't since the original guardianship hearing. He'd thought this fight was over, thought they were safe. But safety, he was learning, was never permanent. It had to be maintained, negotiated, fought for again and again. That evening, he finally told Mara. She listened quietly, face pale, hands twisted in her lap. He wants to visit? She asked. That's what the letter says. Why? Because he's your uncle, and the law says that matters, even though the judge said you belong with me. Mara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, What do you want to do? I want to tell him no. I want to send that letter back and say you're mine, and he's got no claim. Elias's voice was rough. But my lawyer says fighting might make things worse, that we might lose and end up with less control than if we compromise now. What kind of compromise? He could visit. Here, on the ranch, with me present. Not often, maybe 4 times a year. And only if you're willing. Mara chewed her lip, thinking, Would you be there the whole time? Every second. And if I don't like it, can we stop? That's what I'd insist on, yeah. She looked out the window at the spring landscape, green and soft with new growth. I don't hate him, she said finally. He didn't do anything mean to me. He just wasn't there when it mattered. That's fair. But he is family, Mama's and Papa's family, and maybe... She paused, searching for words. Maybe it would be nice to talk to someone who knew them, who could tell me stories about them that I don't remember. Elias felt his chest tighten. He'd been so focused on protecting her from Hutchinson that he hadn't considered what she might gain from knowing him. So you want to do this? He asked. I don't know if I want to, but I think maybe I should. She looked at him. Is that okay? If it's what you want, then yeah, it's okay. Even though it makes things complicated. Mara, things are always going to be complicated. That's just life. He took her hand. But we figure it out, same as always. She squeezed his hand. Together? Together. Pierce drafted a response proposing the visitation terms, and 2 weeks later they received Hutchinson's acceptance. The first visit was scheduled for late April. In the days leading up to it, Elias was wound tight as a spring, checking and rechecking everything, making sure the house was clean, the yard presentable, trying to prepare for something he couldn't quite name. Mara was quieter than usual, not anxious exactly, but thoughtful, preparing herself in her own way. When the day came, Hutchinson arrived in a hired wagon precisely on time. He climbed down, looking uncomfortable in travel-dusty clothes, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Elias met him in the yard, Mara standing slightly behind him. Mr. Mercer, Hutchinson said, formal and stiff. Hutchinson, thank you for agreeing to this. I know it wasn't easy. It wasn't my first choice, Elias said bluntly. But Mara wanted to meet with you, so here we are. Hutchinson's gaze shifted to Mara. Hello, Mara. Hello, Uncle Robert. He held out the package. I brought you something. From Boston. Mara glanced at Elias, who nodded slightly. She stepped forward and took the package, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a book, a beautiful edition of fairy tales with gilt edges and color illustrations. It was your mother's, Hutchinson said quietly. When she was a girl. I thought you might like to have it. Mara's eyes went wide. She ran her fingers over the cover reverently. Really? This was hers? She loved that book. Used to read it to me when I was small and she was supposed to be watching me. He smiled with the memory. She always did the voices. What voices? And just like that, the ice began to thaw. Hutchinson sat on the porch steps, and Mara sat beside him, not too close, but close enough, and he told her stories about her mother, about how she'd been brave and stubborn and kind, about how she'd climbed trees and caught frogs, and once broken her arm falling off a barn roof because she'd been convinced she could fly with a bedsheet cape. Elias stood nearby, watching, listening. He'd expected to feel jealous or threatened, but instead he just felt grateful that Mara was getting something he could never give her, a connection to the parent she'd lost. After an hour, Hutchinson turned to Elias. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Elias nodded, and they walked a short distance away while Mara paged through the book. "I owe you an apology," Hutchinson said. "When I came here last time, I was angry. At myself, mostly, for not being there sooner, for not being the one who saved her. And I took that anger out on you by trying to take her away." "Yeah, you did. I see now that would have been a mistake. Not because you're better than me, I don't know if you are, but because she chose you, and that matters." He looked back at Mara. "She's happy here. I can see that, and I was wrong to try to disrupt it." Elias studied him, looking for the trap, but found only sincerity. "I don't want to be her father," Hutchinson continued. "I can't be. She already had one, and he's gone. But maybe I could be her uncle, really be it. Someone who cares about her, who shows up when it matters, who she knows she can turn to if she needs to. That what you want? That's what I'm asking permission for." Elias thought about all the people in Mara's life now, Constance teaching her, Reverend Martin checking in, the Whitmores inviting her to supper. She was building a web of support, people who cared about her in different ways. Maybe Hutchinson could be part of that too. "All right," Elias said. "But here's the terms. You want to be her uncle? You be consistent. You don't promise things you can't deliver. You don't disappear for months at a time. And you respect that I'm her guardian. I make the decisions about her welfare." "Agreed. And if you ever try to take her from me again, I won't," Hutchinson said firmly. "You have my word." They shook hands, and something that had been twisted tight in Elias's chest finally loosened. The visits became a regular thing, not quarterly, but every few months when Hutchinson could manage the trip from Boston. He brought books and stories, photographs of Mara's parents from before she was born, small pieces of a history she'd thought was lost forever. And slowly, carefully, he became what he'd promised. Not a threat, but family. Spring turned to summer and the heat returned, but it felt different this year. Less oppressive, less cruel. Maybe because they'd survived it once before and knew they could do it again. Mara turned 8 in July, and Constance threw a small party with cake and lemonade. A few families from town came: the Whitmores, Reverend Martin, Mrs. Calloway, and her husband. Even Sheriff Garvin stopped by with a gift, a pocket knife he'd had engraved with Mara's initials. Watching Mara laugh with the other children, cake frosting on her face and joy in her eyes, Elias felt like he was seeing a miracle. This girl who'd stood silent and hollow-eyed in the dust just a year ago was now vibrant and alive, surrounded by people who cared about her. Constance came to stand beside him, watching the children play. "You did good, Elias," she said quietly. "I just gave her a place to land. You gave her more than that. You gave her a reason to believe the world could be kind again." "Well," she patted his arm. "That's no small thing." That night, after everyone had gone and Mara was in bed, Elias sat on the porch looking at the stars. He thought about where he'd been a year ago, alone, purposeless, just going through the motions of existing. He thought about a small girl standing in the heat, hungry and desperate and trusting him with nothing but need. He thought about all the ways that moment could have gone differently, all the reasons he could have given for walking away. And he was grateful, fiercely, overwhelmingly grateful, that he hadn't. The door creaked behind him, and Mara padded out in her nightgown, the doll he'd given her at Christmas tucked under one arm. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too excited." She sat down beside him. "It was a good birthday." "Yeah, it was." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the cicadas and the night wind. "Elias?" "Yeah? When we first met, why did you help me? Really?" He'd asked himself that question 100 times and never found a satisfactory answer. But sitting there with her, safe and loved and looking toward a future that held possibility instead of just survival, maybe the answer didn't matter as much as what came after. "Because you were there," he said finally, "and I could. Sometimes it's that simple." "I'm glad it was you," she said. "Glad you were the one who was there." "Me too, kid." She leaned against him, and they watched the stars wheel overhead, two people who'd found each other in the worst moment and made something good from it. Inside the house, the clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, the world was vast and indifferent. But here, on this porch, in this moment, they had everything that mattered. They had each other. Summer gave way to fall and fall to another winter, and the seasons turned the way they always did. But Elias and Mara turned with them, growing together, learning together, building something that would outlast drought and cold and every hardship the frontier could throw at them. On a crisp October morning 2 years after that first meeting in the dust, Elias was working in the barn when Mara came running from the house, waving a piece of paper. "Elias! Elias, look!" He set down the bridle he was mending. "What is it?" "Letter from Uncle Robert. He's getting married, and he wants us to come to Boston for the wedding." Elias took the letter, read it quickly. Hutchinson was indeed getting married, and he'd written a heartfelt invitation for both of them to attend. "That's real nice," Elias said. "You want to go?" Mara's excitement dimmed slightly. "It's so far away." "It is." "Would you come with me?" "Of course I would. If you want to go, we'll figure it out." She bit her lip, thinking, "I've never been on a train before." "Me neither." "Would we be gone a long time?" "Probably a week or two, but the ranch will keep. We can get the Whitmore boys to watch the animals." Mara looked down at the letter, then back up at him. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need." She went back to the house, and Elias returned to his work, smiling to himself. 2 years ago, the idea of traveling halfway across the country would have been unthinkable. Now it was just a decision to make together. That evening, over supper, Mara brought it up again. "I think I want to go," she said, "to see Uncle Robert get married, to see Boston." "All right, we'll make it happen." "But Elias..." "Yeah?" "This is home. Boston might be exciting, but this is home, right here." He looked at her across the table, this girl who'd become the center of his world without him quite knowing when it happened, and felt his throat tighten. "Yeah," he said, "this is home." She smiled, and they finished their meal planning the trip, talking about trains and cities and all the things they'd see together. Later, after Mara had gone to bed, Elias stood on the porch looking out at the land he'd worked for years. The same land where he'd first seen a hungry child and made a choice that changed everything. He thought about that moment a lot these days, not with regret or wonder, but with quiet gratitude for whatever instinct or grace or pure dumb luck had made him slide that plate of food across the table instead of turning away. One small act of decency in the crushing heat, that's all it had been. But it had been enough. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust and the promise of rain. Elias closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of home, the creak of the barn, the rustle of grass, the gentle breathing of the child sleeping safe inside. "You still got me, kid," he murmured to the night. And somewhere in her dreams, Mara smiled, because she knew it was true. They'd found each other when the heat was unbearable and hope was scarce, two broken people who didn't know they were looking for family. They'd fought for each other, chosen each other, built something real from nothing but stubbornness and love. And now, standing in the cool darkness with stars burning overhead, and tomorrow waiting patient as always, Elias Mercer understood something he'd never quite grasped before. Home wasn't a place you found. It was something you built. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one small act of staying when everyone else walked away. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough and brave enough and foolish enough to try, you got to watch it grow into something beautiful, something worth every hard season, something worth everything. The door opened behind him, and Mara padded out, wrapped in a quilt, eyes sleepy. "Can't sleep again?" he asked. "Just wanted to make sure you were still here." "I'm still here." "Promise?" "Promise." She moved to stand beside him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. Above them, the stars blazed cold and distant. Around them, the frontier stretched vast and unforgiving. But between them, in that small space where a man and a child stood together against the darkness, there was warmth, there was light, there was home. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.